Definitely. Terry's already spotted that if you turn the lights out, you can't see him. Welcome, everyone. I recognise a lot of faces from the AA and other places for the inaugural Rosenberg lectures at the AA. This is a great event. I think as part of the media studies new life under Wjt Mitchell, with a lot of new innovations which will happen, which will become more apparent as the years progress, I'm sure. Terry I've known for a long time, and I think it'll be fun for you to get to know him as a culture within this building. Last night when I was thinking about this introduction, I actually had a sense of the football song for the European finals held in this country, to the tune of "Football's Coming Home." And there's a sense in which Terry is coming home, in coming to the AA and starting to get to know you here. Influence in the creative world is a peculiarly fungal presence, and in a funny way, in a very uncharted way, Terry's wit and sheer intelligence at acting on imagery, acting on drawings, and taking drawings apart with a ferocious intelligence had a tremendous effect on a lot of questioning that was coming through the school in the early 80s, but would never have had his name attached to it. And I think I think there's a strong sense in which, as you get to know him and his approach, resonances will start to occur. So, without more ado, I'd like to introduce Terry, and thank you.
Thanks, and hello, everybody. Peter said he was going to say that this is a level floor, and I do notice it is. What that means, basically, is that although this is a lecture, it seems quite strange. All the lights are off, and I can't see anyone. I hope that there will be some kind of feedback from the audience, some kind of discourse. I know there's a great number of you, and that's quite difficult, but I'm not used to just unrolling my words, as you will hear when I carry on through this talk. I opened my bag and got the wrong notes out. I got the notes out of one of my students who is doing a project on a babel fish. And I suddenly realized that is perhaps what I need here. Firstly, to unpick what I'm doing. Does everyone know what a babel fish is? It's that thing that you glue to your ear so that you can understand noise and all sorts of other language. Anyway, I feel maybe I need a babel fish because I'm voyaging into a territory that I know probably not much more about than anyone else in the room. It's a bit like drawing for me, a bit like going into a space in which I know nothing about. Anyway, I discovered what I've been writing about a couple of brandies ago, and it seems to be this. In this lecture, this is the one I'm finding hardest to do because it is an introductory talk. I'm going to lay a net of discursivity over what I'm about to do next. Basically what I'm saying is that the basis of this talk is visuality, which is the discursive system that lays over the visual field. What I am most interested in and feel most capable of delivering is talks on vision, and that is to come next. I'll explain these terms or get someone else to explain them a little later in the talk. Anyway, here we go. In my creative method, Francis Ponge writes, it may well be that I'm not very intelligent. In any case, ideas are not my forte. I have always been disappointed by them. The most well-founded opinions, the most harmonious, best constructed philosophic systems have always seemed to me utterly precarious. They have caused in me a certain queasiness, an uneasiness, an unpleasant feeling of instability. I haven't the slightest confidence in statements I come out with in a discussion. Contradictory remarks made by others seem just as valid, or let us say, for the sake of precision, neither more nor less valid. I'm easily convinced, easily dissuaded, and when I say convinced, I mean if not of some truth, then at least of the fragility of my own opinion. When asked to deliver these lectures, I was asked what I might contribute to the culture of the AA. I think Peter asked me that. I, with some hesitation, and it would have had to have been, suggested it may be doubt and fragility. Echoing Ponge's position, if we can call it a position, for that may be to set too fast a designation of thought, I am queasy at the notion of trying to deliver an idea or coherent direction of ideas. And yet, ideas are the rubric of these talks. I approve too easily of ideas, and often have to entertain, if not opposing positions, then at least a set of uneasy thoughts and inconclusions. A position like Ponge's, both and at the same time seduced by and distrustful of ideas and unsure of one's own inclination towards them. I'm entertained and seduced by all or many. Don't know what that means. It is difficult coming into this place whose determinations, or at any rate products, may be thought to be certain and stable. I'm riddled with doubt and contradictions. My Woody Allen-esque character and disposition I cannot escape. But the subject of these talks also calls for a courting of doubt. The image and the imagination are only approached through fields of instability and fragility. This uncertainty also seeps into the structure of these lectures, unfortunately. Doubt acts as a thread that works through the series of lectures, drawing observations, ideas, and images together. What is proffered here is a compendium of conjecture and erratic notes, where connections and differences will be suggested or hinted at, and not forced. I do, however, feel that I should range quite broadly over the field, particularly in this first lecture, in order to survey and contextualize the fairly recent pictorial turn in thought. What is proposed cannot be encyclopedic, and therefore is necessarily episodic. Many of these episodes are developed more fully elsewhere, and some remain to be opened up and developed at another time. I am aware that I am sacrificing depth to some extent for breadth in these talks. There is a good deal of the theory and writing about the subject of these talks that I'm still trying to grasp and form opinion about myself. So what qualifies me to give these talks? I'm not really sure. I suppose it's force of circumstance. It's certainly enthusiasm. And it is, I think, a nagging belief that making or forming images, and particularly drawing, is a crucial part of the creative act. Drawing is linked by force of habit, I guess, to creativity. But in the mere act of drawing, is one being creative? I suggest not. Teaching or learning the how-to of drawing, even this phrase is problematic because it presupposes a right way to draw, does not mean that one is connecting thinking to drawing. Drawing is not thought without being situated within a social, political, cultural context. I am not a philosopher, nor a psychologist, anthropologist, scientist, and the list goes on. But as an artist and a teacher, I need to forage in these subjects in which I am not completely at home. My understandings are inevitably less than complete. I adapt the ideas found in these disciplines to my own ends, and they may well be bent unrecognizably out of their original shape. I'm also conscious that there may be much stuff that is relevant to the area of focus that I am not cognizant of, nor understand, perhaps. I make these points conscious of, or should I say self-conscious of, the teaching relationship. I quote from Roland Barthes. Imagine that I am a teacher. I speak endlessly in front of and for someone who remains silent. I am the person who says, I. The detours of one, we, or impersonal sentence make no difference. I am the person who, under the covering of setting out a body of knowledge, puts out a discourse, never knowing how that discourse is being received, and thus forever forbidden the reassurance of a definitive image, even if it is offensive, which would constitute me. In the expose, more aptly named than we tend to think, it is not knowledge which is exposed, it is the subject. It is the subject who exposes himself to all sorts of painful adventures. The mirror is empty, reflecting back to me no more than the falling away of my own language as it gradually unrolls. I am concerned for your regard. And the lecture and I are constituted in this regard. We are, in all senses, visualized. This subtly introduces, or perhaps not so subtly, introduces the topic of the first lecture, visuality, which is constituted as a regard or a gaze. This provides a background to the other lectures which start with vision. I am new to visuality, usually dealing with matters much closer in. The rest of the lectures begin in vision, thankfully, but it is impossible not to consider its intertwining with visuality. Therefore, this first lecture. This first lecture is a beginner's guide to visuality. Hal Foster writes, why vision and visuality? Why these terms? Although vision suggests sight as a physical operation and visuality sight as a social fact, the two are not opposed. Vision is social and historical too, yet they are not identical. Here the difference between the terms signals a difference within the visual, between the mechanism of sight and its historical techniques, between the datum of vision and its discursive determinations. I'm not being fully honest in this. There are other agendas. One of the agendas is to try and form a link between this visuality and imagination. If visuality is a discursive system, then imagination is the movement that we have within practice. The other thing I am eager to answer is the criticism of Plato, a little late, perhaps, but also answer some of the problems that we're having with the image in the postmodern persuasion. I'll start with Plato. Plato in Book 10 of the Republic reveals his disapproval of the image and argues against the painter's entry into the polis. He takes as example 3 beds. The first is made by God and exists in the ultimate nature of things. The second is made by the carpenter from God's original, and the third is produced by the painter from the carpenter's bed. The painter's image is thus thrice removed from the original. He trades in ignorance and deceit. These are Plato's words. I have trouble saying them, being an artist. The artist's craft is a pseudo. That is a lie. He goes on to list further accusations. He says, it teaches us nothing. The image teaches us nothing. He says, it is of no functional importance. He says it is irrational. It appeals to animals. He says it appeals to animal and erotic desires. It introduces conflict and confusion in vision. It is immoral because it causes people to imitate its faults. And it tends towards idolatry. The imagination of the artist brazenly imitates the activity of the divine demiurge by holding a mirror to the surrounding world. As a painter, I would like to make some sort of defense, but it is a defense against a doubled attack. The end of painting has again been proclaimed, and in my support for the image, there's also a defense, I hope, for a certain kind of image making. All right, we should perhaps define rather belatedly, perhaps, some terms. According to Richard Kearney, and I urge you to read the book, Wake of the Imagination, the imagination may be understood in 4 ways. 1, the ability to bring to mind objects which exist elsewhere but are not present at that time. 2, the construction of figures, forms, etc. to represent real things in an unreal way. 3, the fictional projection of non-existent things into the real. And 4, the capacity of human consciousness to become fascinated by illusions, confusing what is real with what is unreal. Okay, in looking at these 4 modes, we may suggest 2 ways in which we may create images. The first, representationally, reproducing a correlative of an existing reality. And the second is generative, producing novel images which are not prefigured in the world. I suggest there's an imbrication between these 2 ways, and in this, there's opportunity to explore all sorts of creative possibilities. There is artifice in the representational image, and this itself can lead one to make all sorts of inventions and come to undetermined solutions. And there's, carrying on, and there's no absolute invention in the generative image. It touches the world, it touches the representational image. The unicorn does not exist without the horse and the, whatever the horn comes from, I'm not sure where it comes from. The imagination is in touch with the world. The image I understand to be the instance of delay in the flow of the imagination, that which shows the movement of the imagination. Kearney, in the Wake of Imagination, tables 3 historical paradigms of the Western imagination. These are not to be understood as pointing to a linear history of imagination, but as tools to read a general disposition of understanding which governs a specific period and informs the specific way people conceptualize the relationship between imagination and reality. These are the mimetic paradigm of the pre-modern imagination, the productive paradigm of the modern imagination, and the parodic paradigm of the postmodern imagination. Here is a history of the imagination in 3 lines. Each paradigm may be illustrated through a correlative image that may characterize the dominant function of the imagination at a given time. The mimetic preaches the referential figure of the mirror. It is an external copy of nature, its image rather, is an external copy of nature, which is itself a copy of an external copy of a transcendental idea, the bed of a bed of a bed. Or, in the Christian cosmogony, the deity's work. Its representational figure could be the puppet. The view is theocentric, it turns back to God. But in some way, this view is doubled. It is God that looks at his image. This we will see in one of the slides that I have lined up for you. The productive has the expressive figure of the lamp. It is humanist. The images are produced by a subject who is centered and central in the world. The view is anthropocentric. It is human-based. And the robot, I suggest, is its figure. The parodic is the reflexive figure of a labyrinth of looking glasses. The subject is reduced to a pure screen for all the network of influences. I've raided my Baudrillard. The world is a text. If it is a mirror then, it is a mirroring of mirrors. The view is eccentric, and its figure is probably the clone. But I'm going to try and persuade you that it should be the mutant. This is rather glib. I do not nor cannot give you a genealogy of the imagination. I leave that to Richard Kearney. In the space of this lecture, I'm not able to, nor am I qualified to do so. I just need to establish a background to some concerns and issues that follow. And to do this, I have made huge generalizations, but they are directed to a certain point. I'm trying to make here a new formulation of the imagination that matches the formulation of visuality. The postmodern dismantles both the pre-modern and the modern imagination. It critiques the pre-modern imagination in the opposite direction to Plato. It critiques it because it is a repression of the human agency, deferring to the name of the deity. It critiques the modern for its egocentrism, the individual at the center of meaning. In the postmodern, the image may already reign supreme in contemporary culture. This is a quote from Kearney. The world is awash in images. The apparati and technologies of the media allow us to reproduce in a pornographic excess the world as image. It is an orgy of mirror play, an ecstasy of communication. We now no longer know who or what produce or control the images which condition our consciousness. They are random and formless, certainly without reason, and almost inevitably unlikely to have rhyme. This is quite important, the notion of rhyme or rhythm in what constitutes the field of the visual. Italo Calvino calls this a plague. It afflicts both the image and the word. In 6 memos for the next millennium, he writes of language, but it equally applies to imagery. It is a plague afflicting language, revealing itself as a loss of cognition and immediacy, an automatism that tends to level out all expression into the most generic, anonymous, and abstract formulas, to dilute meanings, to blunt the edge of expressiveness, extinguishing the spark that shoots out from the collision of word and the new circumstance. We can easily add image in the place of word. He goes on to address the image and the mediatized image particularly. These are images stripped of the inevitability that ought to mark every image as form and as meaning, as a claim on the attention and as a source of possible meanings. Much of the cloud of visual images fades at once, like the dreams that leave no trace in the memory. But what does not fade is a feeling of alienation and discomfort. He suggests that this lack of substance is not found in images or language alone, but in the world itself. Probably preaching to the converted. We've all read our postmodernism. This plague striking also at the lives of people and the history of nations. This plague closes down the image. The image is not ventilated by thought, nor does it blow through thought. The agency that animates the image, that is, the human ability to imagine or image, is not present within the image. We have got rid of the creative subject. The contaminating agent or virus may well be the image itself, and what it attacks is not only itself, but the reality it ostensibly depicts. The real and the imaginary are indistinguishable in this postmodern world. Even in the everyday, the image is exchanged for the real. This is probably a well-worn anecdote. The housewife who when complimented about the beauty of her child replies, "Thank you, but you should see the photograph." Richard Kearney writes, "We are at an impasse where the very rapport between imagination and reality seem not only inverted but subverted altogether. We cannot be sure which is which, and this very undecidability lends weight to the deepening suspicion that we may well be assisting at the wake of imagination." He uses the word wake advisedly. It has 3 meanings. It is the end of the imagination. It is the way he tracks the imagination. And actually, it is his hope for the imagination. It is the way he wishes to awaken the imagination. It is at this point I wish to join him. The postmodern persuasion is that the creative imagination is dead. It's on its last legs. Certainly, it would appear that we are witnessing the end of the imagination as we have known it. Postmodernist thought creates a dilemma of paralysis. Some revel in it, enjoying its apocalyptic vision. Some are trying to resist its fatalism. What we cannot do is revisit the humanist imagination. We cannot revisit its utopian vision, its linear history, its egocentrism, its masculinity, and so on and so on. One of the most persuasive strategies of resistance to the erosion of the subject lies within the visual field, and this is where I'd like to conjoin the two. Martin J. notes, the new fascination with modes of seeing and the enigmas of visual experience evident in a wide variety of fields may well betoken a shift in the cultural imaginary of our age. What has been called a pictorial turn bids fair to succeed the earlier linguistic turns so loudly trumpeted by the 20th century philosophers. The model of reading texts which serve productively as the master metaphor for post-objectivist interpretations of many different phenomena is now giving way to models of spectatorship and visuality which refuse to be described in entirely linguistic terms. About time too. Actually, this is 10 years old. So we are at the edge of this pictorial term. The subject can be reconstituted in the gaze of the other. This is what visuality teaches us. This shows itself in what is described as the new professionalism, term I only heard the other day. The new journalism, the new anthropology, where the subject enters their subject matter, where the subject and object conflate. This notion can be taken forward to the imagination. And what Kearney proposes, and I suggest is prefigured in the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, is the notion of a dialogic imagination, which carries an ethical purpose. No alibi. An imagination of responsibility. He also places with it and over it a poetic imagination. This is a little harder to describe. It is the beat. It is the on-off. It is the copulatory function of imaging. James Joyce explains it. Well, it doesn't explain it, but I quote from Finnegan's Wake because it illustrates it. He talks of a nighttime consciousness. And in this nighttime consciousness, there is two thinks at a time. And these two thinks at a time happen between two minds. This constitutes what I believe is the poetic imagination, the connections at the deeper level. Rosalind Krauss talks about this as the pulse. The best way to understand the pulse, and I've been struggling with it while writing these lectures, is in terms of poetry. It is both the imagery and the beat. Bachelard talks about it as resonance. He then reconstitutes it as reverberations. Rosalind Krauss detects this, as we shall see in the slides, in Marcel Duchamp's rotor reliefs. Anyway, I'm about ready to answer Plato's criticisms. I maybe should find them again. If the new imagination, the poetic dialogic, goes ahead, does it teach us nothing? I suggest that thinking happens in the copulatory. It happens in the connections. It happens in the deeper level. It happens when there's no expectations for thinking. Is it of any use? I believe it must be. It is irrational. It appeals to animal and erotic desires. I think this is exactly what it needs to do. It introduces conflict and confusion in vision, perhaps, and maybe it should. It is immoral, causing people to imitate its faults. Don't know quite how that works within it. It tends towards idolatry, the imagination of the artist brazenly imitating the activity of the divine demiurge. Well, this it certainly does not do. The other accusation is the death of painting. What that means is that image making, I feel, is removed from all creative practice. I see it happening. I see it happening when people use the image for the outcome and not for the process and not for the thinking. I see it where there is no doubt in the image. Heidegger says of thinking, he says, in this thought-provoking time of ours, what is worth thinking about? What is worth thinking about in this most thought-provoking time, he suggests, is that which has not yet been thought about. I'm going to go on to the slides now, and hopefully through that I'll be able to talk more about the other and more about the gaze. For these are the things that constitute visuality. A couple of brandies too many. The gaze Peter gave me an example for, and I think I should share it with you. How is the aeroplane held aloft? How does vision work to keep the aeroplane in the air? What are the gazes of the other? There's the gaze of the controller on the ground. There's the gaze of the pilot. There's the gaze of the passengers. There's the gaze of the designer. This constitutes the visual field. This constitutes visuality. Actually, as we go along, we'll see that visuality is not a definite term. Hal Foster, I think it's Martin Jay, describes it as a dark continent waiting to be explored. Terms seem to wriggle around. I was looking for ways to describe the other to you. I was looking for ways to describe the gaze. It seems to be anything it needs to be. And certainly, if it advances, if visuality becomes the leading turn for thought, we need to start to query this undecidability of the other. I need to work this. No. Which one is it?
There you go.
I dealt with one aspect of the talk, and I've certainly left out what constitutes most of the talk. This gives clue. I believe that thought needs a place to roost, needs a place in which it is delayed. It's a term I borrow from Duchamp. What I call this place is a support. It has materiality. The support lies in different places in the triangulation of image, object, subject, and other. This is what we're going to tease out in the next 3 weeks. Well, a little bit of it. Here's Picasso, drawing. The support for the image is air. It is constituted in light. He defines the plane by the image. We read the plane on that. It needs the plane of the photograph. It needs the other mechanism of recording. The image is doubly constituted. It is constituted as drawing, and it's constituted as photograph. Where are we? Okay, this is going to open up the talk further. One of the ideas for this talk was to try and develop a coffee table book in which I had images of thought. Everyone should have their image of thought, perhaps. Maybe it should be tattooed on them. This is my image of thought. And what I like about it is it's not the ambigraph of Derrida. Here we have the polygraph. Here we have the multiple image. And what it does is speaks of its support. What you have in front of you. Let's have some stuff back. What is it? It's an eye. We'll see that it is an eye in the next slide. What else is it? Come on, use that imaging of yours. It's a? I didn't get that. A white wall. You're right, you picked out the screen. Good. Good, it is constituted on the screen. Good. It is supported by that screen. It is a Mexican down a well, perhaps. A fat Mexican? You get him? Target? Sound. Series of vibrations coming from a center. Each one of these images is constituted in a different relationship to the support. We have the same support, but the image requires the support to change. And this is what triggered off the whole idea for these lectures. This simple thing. Where is the image when you say the Mexican is down the well? Or if you have the tunnel? I mean, where is the support? Where is that thing which holds the image? Which is that flat plane on which the image is constituted? What we have, if we suggest that he's in the well, is a view. We have our window. The Mexican lies behind the window. If we have the fat Mexican, what we've got is a pavement. I've suggested it's the dissecting table. If we have the target, well then the image and the support are one. Certainly the area that Jasper Johns and others have worked in. The notion that the image becomes object. This is the area of the map and the diagram. It is also, for the mathematicians, a series of 2 pi r1 plus r2 plus r3, I think. It can be constituted in various forms. And this is what I think we should be investigating within this over-texture that we're laying on it of visuality. Have I said all the relationships of the image? The other is a series of incisions, a series of holes to be jumped over, carved in semicircles. That might be Deleuze's image, the series of fractures in a plateau, and so on. There's many other ways we could interpret that image. What I'm eager to talk about before we go on is the relationship of the word to the image. Let me find my person here. I'm so busy looking through. And this can be seen on both the local and the higher level. We've just talked about the fact that the linguistic turn had been removed the visual turn had been removed from thought because the whole thing was structured around linguistics. Now there's an imbrication of the two. There's an overlap of the two. There's a haunting of the image and the word. What you have in front of you is Jasper John's brick. A brick he made to be thrown at the critic. It's called The Critic Speaks. The critic has no eyes. A series of mouths that burble through these spectacles. I felt this was a strong image to take forward as an image maker. And I'm going to refer to Wjt Mitchell, if I can ever find him. I've got lost here as well. Who talks about this contrast between the image and the word. Excuse me 1 second while I try and find it. Trouble in looking for Plato. I quote Wjt Mitchell at long last. The history of culture is in part the story of a protracted struggle for dominance between pictorial and linguistic signs, each claiming proprietary rights to a nature to which only it has access. At some moments, this struggle seems to settle into a relationship of free exchange along open borders. At other times, the borders are closed and a separate peace is declared. Among the most interesting and complex versions of this struggle is what might be called the relationship of subversion. This is a relationship in which language or imagery looks into its own heart and finds lurking there its opposite number. One version of this relationship has haunted the philosophy of language since the rise of empiricism. It is the suspicion that beneath words, beneath ideas, the ultimate reference in the mind is the image. It is the impression of outward experience printed, painted, or reflected in the surface of consciousness. It was this subversive image that Wittgenstein sought to expel from language, which the behaviorists sought to purge from psychology, and which contemporary art theorists have sought to cast out of pictorial representation itself. This relationship of subversion, I suggest, indexes the imbrication of word and image. Each is haunted by the other, and the use and analysis of one is not possible with acknowledging the other in its heart. However, it should be noted that it is an imbrication. This is a thing like tiling, one thing just overlapping the other like that. And it is not a conflation of word and image, and that there are crucial differences between the two. At the deepest level, the significance of the image is extralingual. And through a semiological analysis of an image, drawing, painting, etc., it will go some way in structuring a reading of the image, but there will still be an essential bit of the puzzle that will remain undetermined. What Rosalind Krauss calls the optical unconscious. I still believe, in spite of trying to give you this overview of visuality, that it is a natural attitude to imaging. I still believe that there's something out here in the engagement. And I'm rather eager to dispel the notion that what you're trying to illustrate is this discursive system called visuality that we're laying over the inquiry into the image. I'm concerned here to mention the relationship of theory to practice. I believe that the relationship is often misunderstood and is often inappropriately applied. Theory can suffocate the creative act. It suffocates it if it becomes the only referent. In other words, we look at theory rather than through it. The creative outcomes will be reduced, inevitably formulaic and uninspired if the imagination cannot move in, through and beyond the theoretical formulations that underpin it. Off-the-peg meanings do not guarantee that work will be significant. It makes no sense to me to go from this final thought to thinking. And yet there are those that use this process. It's what might be referred to as deontological. How about that? The other way theory is misapplied is when defense for inadequate work is made by recourse to popular theories whose connections are at best tenuous and in most instances false. I've seen students, teachers and practitioners, artists, designers and architects create makeshift ties and build asses' bridges to bind their work to the words which they use to justify it. The work remains emphatically unimproved. The discursive system is not something you address, it's something you do. You do not work from the discursive system of visuality back to vision. You work from vision to the discursive system. Although there are odd things that may be learned if we look through the discursive system and not at it. This is another illustration to show the imbrication of word and image. What do you see? Who's seen the young lady? Who's seen the old hag? The fact that you have to name them to know them means that underneath vision is this dovetailing with language. There is a conceptual base to vision. However, can you tell yourself that that both lines are the same length? I suggest that although you tell yourself, you cannot force the image to go that way. This is the bit that escapes language. Right, I use Man Ray's eye. The idea here is of Rosalind Krauss's pulse, a tick-tock of the eye. An auditory command, a thing that goes into the deeper consciousness. This pulse she seeks within work. I'm going to use, let's go through all our philosophers here. Which one should I pick? I think this is problematic as well, using a range of philosophers to illustrate what you're thinking. But I do it as a crutch. Lyotard gives the name to this notion, the matrix. It belongs to the unconscious. The matrix is the form of the primary process as it operates invisibly. As it operates invisibly behind the constraints of repression, such that only its phantasmatic products ever surface onto the field of the visible. The matrix can then only be inferred, only be reconstructed from the figuration provided by fantasy. There are three determinations. First, it involves a spatiality that is unassimilable to the coordinates of the external space, the space of the unconscious. The matrix does not order and regulate difference. It maintains oppositions it does not regulate difference, maintaining oppositions in a rule-governed system. Rather, it courts the transformation of everything into its opposite, undermining the productive work of structure. The elements of the matrix do not form a system but a block. The matrix, this is the third determination, is in its formal condition a rhythm or pulse. Bachelard looks at this, as we have said before. He sends out sonar readings into the material of his imagination. What Bachelard puts in place is the notion of a material imagination that lies in contrast to the formal imagination. This material imagination is constituted of the four elements. In his Water and Dreams, he suggests that there are three ways to look at the water. In its depth, in its surface. I've done something, I know Daniel's over there. somewhere in the audience. Daniel built a reservoir for our students at Goldsmiths. The gaze on the reservoir was constituted in a number of ways. Firstly, we were to look down on the reservoir. Secondly, we were to be on its surface. And thirdly, we were to go into its depth. This in some way relates to what Bachelard says, the notion of resonances, repercussions, and reverberations. These are what happen through the material of imagination. This needn't be something just over here, but can be something out here. And that's where it gets interesting. The rotor reliefs by Marcel Duchamp. Here, Rosalind Krauss sees the pulse as an eroticizing beat, an in-out. And here the auditory is applied to the visual most literally. I need to say something about the literal a bit later, actually. What it is, I mean, how many of you know this, the rotor reliefs of Duchamp? He takes a turntable and he takes the record, the vinyl, and he paints on it. So there's a direct attachment to the auditory. And these are called his precision optics. And what he does is spin them. And there is a pulse within this. An eroticization of the image is what Rosalind Krauss calls it. There's a moving forward into phallus and into vaginal depth. The thing starts to pop out and go in. There's a notion that this attaches to Bataille's the eye, or rather Bataille's eye, where what happens is metaphorical. We have this transfer between things according to almost their ocularity, to do with their construction as spheres. We move from the concavity to the convexity. Look at the next. Where am I? Sorry, Turkey. Yes, we are in Turkey. Good. This is what I've done here. This is in Cappadocia. I've thought to look at the notion that the eye not only receives light, but may transmit it. It's certainly been a thing that has hung around folklore, the idea of the evil eye. And what we have here is a church in which the iconoclasts have come in and attacked the eyes of the images. What has happened is the gaze is not the gaze of the spectator, it's the gaze of the image. The spectator is not central to this. This is not a perspectival space. The spectator is surrounded by the images looking at them. And what they have found, the Muslims found, the iconoclasts found, was that these were other. And they needed to erase the gaze of the other. They were threatened by the gaze of the other. And the gaze of the other is what I'm going to deal with in the next image. I hope. Yes. There are a couple of passages that keep coming up in these books on visuality. There's a track of the gaze from Lacan to Sartre. It doesn't seem to go anywhere else but from Sartre to Lacan or Lacan to Sartre. And it's a way of explaining this gaze. Let us imagine that moved by jealousy, this is taken from Being and Nothingness and discusses the look. Let us imagine that moved by jealousy, curiosity or vice. I have just glued my eye to the door. Actually, when I first wrote that out, it was ear. To the door, and looked through a keyhole. I am alone and on the level of a non-thetic. I didn't know what that meant. That means not positively laid down. Self-consciousness. This means, first of all, that there is no self to inhabit my consciousness. Nothing, therefore, to which I can refer my acts in order to qualify them. They are in no way known. I am my acts, and hence they carry in themselves their whole justification. I'm pure consciousness of things, and things are caught up in the circuit of my selfishness. They offer to me their potentialities of proof. They offer to me my own possibilities. But suddenly, footsteps come down the corridor. And he is shamed by the look of the other. And what I see in this image is a great illustration of this look of the other. What we have is a plane on which an image is being produced. The image behind it is just displaced. In front of it is an ambiguous figure. Is this the keyhole through which Sartre is looking? What some of the visualists, I might call them, would find is that in the blackness is the other. This is the place where the subject disappears. I think they take the other to great lengths. And I think that perhaps in the dark continent is where some of the research should happen. The other thing it may be is the shadow of Sartre. It could be Sartre, I'm just supposing that he enters this image. Or it could be the shadow of the person looking. We are looking at person or shadow. That strange undecidability of the image is what lurks in visuality. Norman Bryson, I couldn't get the exact image he illustrates his idea or notion on, thinks that the other lies in the blank, in the nothing. And this is echoed in some of the writings on Deleuze. I've just been reading a critical reader in which the first chapter talks about the other through Melville's Moby Dick. And Ahab looks into the white spume. He looks into the nothing and tries to find the I. He tries to find the other in the spray. What Bryson does is takes this notion of the whiteness of the page as his other, this place of annihilation. But what he does is also talks about the way the image is constituted, socially formed, that there is a set of rules here. But sometimes the artist, and in this particular instance, will allow the formation of the image to be given up to what, again, Bryson calls the other. I think these terms are too movable. And that is to the vagaries of chance, to the splat of the brush, to the movement of the wind, to the run of the paper. I prefer this. The gaze and the notion of the other looking. The fact that she has turned away from the eye that looks at her because all she can see is I. Here's my diagram again, but now in a reticule. It's at the window. It's gridded up. It's mapped. But you cannot see beyond the eye. The eye frames the image, and she needs her visuality to be constituted by the vision of another. I think it's Gladys Murphy. No, it's Emily that needs to constitute that image. Okay. This was a thing that happened at the turn of the 19th century. Not the turn, in the 19th century, they were obsessed by the magic box, the illusion, the phantoms, but they were also obsessed by its mechanism. And the gaze here runs from being within the illusion and observing the illusion. It feels a bit like this talk in some ways. What we have is me jousting with the spectres of the other, and you watching me do it. That reconstitutes the gaze in this thing in another way. Any talk I have has to have this slide in it, no matter what I'm doing. This is Marcel Duchamp, and it's called Tu. And what I suggest happens here is he has decanted the image. The image is taken from its context. It's taken from its bottle and decanted on the page. And what he has here is a catalogue of possible images. They do not constitute images themselves. The title of the piece is Tu, I can't say it, Tu. It hasn't got the verb. It's got the you and the me, but it hasn't got what it wants to happen in that space between you and me. It is about creativity. We've got the finger, which is painted by another. We have the ripped canvas, which some might say reveals the fragility, the possible annihilation, and therefore the other, held together by the reel of a safety pin. We have catalogued their perspective, but we are not centered by this perspective. This perspective does not have any way of relating to a spectator. We do not know where to stand to regard these color swatches moving away. The image comes from without, it's cast shadow. It is a series of standard stoppages dropped onto the surface. We have my 3 circles here. We have different places for the image. And we have this catalogue. This just shows you a close-up of the real bottle brush coming out of the fake gash held by real safety pins. So there's this whole notion of a play of shadows, a shadow play. We'll see how Duchamp was very influenced in this. For the next and the last part, because I think I've gone on too long. Oh, this is just another Duchamp étant donné, where we are created as voyeur, we are created as peep artists looking into the peephole. Does anyone know the étant donné, the doors? I put this image in place because the other has been able to move the gaze away from masculinity. At this point, it is still the masculine gaze. But the gaze of the other happens, some Irit Rogoff and others have taken it on as the mutant, the lesbian, the cyborg, the marginal cultures. The gaze of the marginal culture have started to enter visuality. I put that in place just to focus on that. If anyone wants to read further on that, Jacqueline Rose, Gaze in the Sexual Gaze, or Gaze in the Sexual Field, is an important read. Anyway, my coffee table books, just to end on a lighter note. I just like the idea of these images of thought. But I think someone perhaps should write a history of the thought bubble and do an analysis of it. Because here we have what should be three-dimensional, a bubble, something without form, and it is constituted as section on the page. It actually breaks in as a sort of a macula into the image, usually, although I've taken this out of a how-to book, so it doesn't do so, but you'll see it in the next thing. The other thing that this illustrates is the notion that there is an ocularity in thinking, the notion that we have light within our thought. I put this in here because this is the camera obscura, and this is the paradigm for thought in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. It gives us the cogito, Descartes. It gives us the inner space of Locke. Their thought was built on, their philosophies were built on the notion of the camera obscura, the centered figure who had this image in their head, the vacated image. Who was watching the image? This was critiqued later as a total reductivism, because who watches the watcher? I tried to get Beano, what is it, the clangers, to show the numbskulls, but I thought that might act just as well, to show you what we still, I think, carry around with us as the notion of thought. I'm going to flip through these so I can see people going now. Play a guessing game. Whose thought is this? Marcel Duchamp. The notion of the hinge, the sign of accordance, the in-between. He sometimes calls it the bateau mouche, that which passes on the river. The sign of accordance and the hinge is what acts between two different dimensions. The third and the fourth and the fifth. He has this idea of an n-dimensional continuum. And at the hinge, which in his famous large glass is the isolating plate, it is in fact a large hinge. He has this world of infraslim. This ran in advance of the notion of the pun in the parody. Well, in fact, he used the pun in the parody that happened within postmodernist play. And in the world of infraslim, he would say something like, we have infraslim when the tobacco smoke smells of the mouth that exhaled it. It's a game of transfer, a game of impossibilities that are played in that space. And I think that is a very creative territory. If anyone's read the beginner's guides too, they would know that this is Derrida. The notion of a privileged and a marginal thought, the idea of a pulsing backwards and forwards between the two. He suggests that this is an either-or that becomes and. Both exist at the same time. But if it is an and, I suggest it may be gridlocked. And these certainly are the aporias and the deadlocks of meaning that his colleague Leman ran into. But I don't think one can perhaps tar him with the same brush. What there is an opticality, a kind of movement in and out. We have op art. His image of thought is op art. This is Deleuze. The notion that he took, this is the structure he took. It was like a wave breaking. He took this image of the Baroque towards his analysis of other art and other ideas. And I like the idea that we take the image to thought, and that we take the image to imaging itself. And that's what we'll be looking at in the next few weeks. I leave you with this. I'm jumping ship. Actually, there's much I didn't say here, but I will just leave you with this. And I think there's a beautiful passage by Heidegger. I do not have it on me, but I'll try and remember it as best I can. And he says, as I've said earlier, what calls for thinking? And he says that which is not yet thought about. And he says, we have to go into what withdraws. And the way we go into what withdraws is by drawing into what withdraws. And how we draw into what withdraws is through the handicraft of thinking. And he takes the handicraft to the hand. And that's where I'd like to leave it, really, because I still believe, and I would like to advance this in the other talks coming up, that the basis of creative thought is sleight of mind and conjecture of hand. Thank you.
If anybody has any questions for Terry, there are a few minutes to take.
Like what the hell was that all about? Might be a good starting point.
If not, questions can be taken probably in the bar.
A brandy or two later.
A brandy or two later.
Nothing? It was all clear.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.